John chapter 19, starting in verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea during the period of time that we read about here in John. Judea, of course, was under Roman rule during this time, so Pilate was a Roman. And so his allegiance and his responsibility was to Rome and to Rome only. And so Pilate would have been very uninterested, would have cared very little about the law of Moses or any other Jewish customs, except that he was accountable to Caesar to maintain order and control over his largely Jewish jurisdiction. And so to that end, it certainly makes sense that on a big feast occasion like the Passover, where Jews from all over the place would descend on Jerusalem, it would make sense that on a day like that, Pilate would make an appearance. And on this particular Passover, Pilate arrived to find this big uproar about a rabbi, a teacher named Jesus. And this group of Jewish leaders have brought him before him and insisted that he be killed. This probably wasn't Pilate had planned for this particular day. And you get the sense very early in this account in all four Gospels that Pilate didn't want anything to do with this situation from the very beginning. But it doesn't take Pilate very long to realize he's going to have to do something. And so he brought Jesus in for some questioning. And in that conversation, Pilate learned some things about Jesus. He learned that Jesus declared very openly that he was a king, but that he had a kingdom that wasn't of this world. And most importantly, from Pilate's perspective, he was no military or armed threat to anybody. And so Pilate left that conversation probably with plenty more questions. What is truth? Maybe being the most famous there from John chapter 18. He may have found Jesus to be a little bit strange, but was all the more convinced that Jesus had done nothing deserving of death. Pilate would have tried several death row inmates in his career. He knew what that type of person sounded and looked like, and this Jesus just didn't fit that mold at all. But if that wasn't reason enough for Pilate not to want to go through with killing Jesus, you may recall that a big influence in Pilate's wife, Mrs. Pilate, was equally, if not more, convicted that Jesus should not die. You see, she had been having some dreams and had sent word to her husband to have nothing to do with this just man, Matthew 27 and verse 19. And so you can see Pilate's dilemma. On the one hand, he's got a man in his custody who he believes to be innocent and that he has no desire to execute. But on the other, he's got this angry crowd of people that he is responsible for governing, who it seems will only be satisfied if Jesus is dead. So Pilate does what leaders do, and he came up with a few ideas. And the way I read it, he made at least 3 separate attempts to try to sort of wiggle out of this situation, to restore order without having to kill Jesus. His first attempt to solve his problem was to simply make it somebody else's problem. Maybe you've tried something like that in your life. You see, the chief priests made a bit of a mistake when they presented Jesus to Pilate, because they told him in Luke 23 and verse 5 that this Jesus had begun stirring up the people in Galilee. And when Pilate heard that word Galilee, he quickly wanted to know if this man was a Galilean. When he thankfully learned that he was, Pilate thought he was off the hook. You see, Herod, specifically Herod Antipas, was in charge in Galilee and was also in Jerusalem for the Passover. And what kind of put the icing on the cake for this particular solution for Pilate was that he and Herod weren't exactly getting along very well at this time. And so you can see Pilate's idea: I'll get out of this situation myself, and I'll put it in the lap of somebody that I don't particularly like. Maybe seems like a win-win. But it wasn't very long before Pilate found Jesus right back in his own court, with Herod having tried him, mocked him, and treated him with contempt, but sent him away. It's interesting, in Luke 23 and verse 12, that we're told that very day Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. Some have speculated that maybe Pilate gained some level of respect for Herod through this whole exchange, in that he too was unwilling to kill an innocent man simply to satisfy the Jews. But whatever the reason, this does seem to be maybe a last-minute foreshadowing, a last-minute indication of Jesus making peace by the blood of his cross, Colossians 1 and verse 20. And so with plan A, if you will, unsuccessful, Pilate moved on to plan B. And this particular scheme involved taking advantage of an annual custom that he had in his dealings with the Jews. He had a habit once a year at Passover of releasing one prisoner to them as a show of goodwill. And once again, Pilate thought he had come up with a clever solution. He had a man in his custody who was a murderer, a robber, and an insurrectionist, and maybe most importantly, a criminal with some name recognition. He had Barabbas, and the Jews knew his rap sheet, and when that name was brought up, the Jews knew exactly what type of tough customer they were dealing with. And so Pilate gave them a simple choice. You can have this Barabbas, this wicked, violent criminal roaming the streets once again where your children play, or I can release to you this Jesus, who I am telling you is no criminal. Surely their fear of Barabbas, Pilate thought, was greater than their hatred of Jesus. But given this choice, it seems that the Jews surprised Pilate. And they famously said, "Give us Barabbas and crucify Jesus," Matthew 27, 21, and 22. Pilate had miscalculated just how deeply the Jews hated Jesus and just how badly they wanted him dead. And so with his second plan foiled, Pilate moved on once again. And his last attempt to solve his problem, I think, gets more at the heart of what originated the problem to begin with. As the events of the last few hours had unfolded, Pilate had learned some things about these Jews' true motives for wanting to kill Jesus. You may remember that they presented Jesus initially as a blasphemer. Right? This man, he says he is God, he's made himself God, and so he is deserving of death under our Jewish law. And Pilate's response to that was essentially, what does that have to do with me? You take him and judge him according to your own law. But the Jews told him that it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Do you see maybe a contradiction in that? Pilate, we are so righteously angry at this man for breaking our Jewish law that we need you to help us circumvent that same law to put him to death. It wasn't good enough for the Jews to judge him according to their own law. They wanted him dead now, and they needed Pilate's help to do that. They wanted Jesus dead much more than they simply wanted God's law obeyed. It's pretty easy, I think, for us to see through that as we read these gospel accounts, and I think Pilate saw through it too. And the reason I feel that way is Matthew 27 and verse 18 tells us rather plainly, "For Pilate knew that the Jews had handed Jesus over to him because of envy." Pilate realized that Jesus had something that the Jews wanted. I'm not sure how specifically Pilate understood exactly what it was that the Jews were envious of, but it was clear to him that they were threatened by Jesus in some sense. I mean, think about what their actions have said. They want him dead immediately. We're not willing to judge him according to our own law. And we would rather have wicked, violent Barabbas released to us instead of this Jesus. Pilate sees him and certainly doesn't see any threat himself, but he knows that the Jews think he's a threat. Jesus had spent a period of years at this point proclaiming rather openly to be the Son of God. And these Jews had tried over and over unsuccessfully to prove that he wasn't. And so they'd gotten to the point where they were just going to resort to simply killing him. And so it seems that Pilate reasoned to himself and thought, if I can just convince these people that Jesus isn't God, that he's just a man, that there's nothing special, nothing threatening about him, maybe then they'll let this whole thing go and they won't demand his crucifixion any longer. And I think that takes us right back to the beginning of John 19 that we read at the beginning. Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Please don't miss that. Bible language is often rather concise and frankly much less dramatic than our day-to-day speech. I think about there at the end or at the beginning of Matthew chapter 4, where we're told that Jesus had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was hungry. The Bible put things rather concisely, and we can blow by it pretty quickly if we don't stop and take our time. Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Pilate had his soldiers strike Jesus with a whip, with sharp pieces of metal and other things attached at the end designed to tear apart skin and flesh. Some men died from the floggings alone. They fashioned a crown of thorns. After all, he is a king, and they pressed it into his scalp. They put on him a royal purple robe and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. We're told in another account that some of the soldiers made a little game out of it. "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is it who struck you?" And so you can imagine what Jesus must have looked like when we get to verses 4 and 5, when Pilate brought him back out before the people. Verse 4, Pilate goes back out before them and reiterates once again, "I find no fault in this man." And then verse 5, he brings Jesus back out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And he says, "Behold the man." And I wonder if maybe another way of saying that might have been, "Behold, this is no God. This is a man. I mean, look what I've done to him. He's no threat to you. There's no reason for you to be intimidated by him. This is a man." And do you know how I know he's a man? Because he bleeds like one. And because he groans, and he slumps, and he writhes, and he suffers, and he takes this persecution and this suffering just like any other man. "Behold the man," Pilate said, because that's all that he is. And I think it's so critically important for us as we prepare to come to the table this morning to, as very best we can, behold the man ourselves. I'll speak at least for myself. I think it can be pretty easy to walk into a very comfortable building, wearing our nice clothes, seated around people that we very much like. And by the way, none of those things should change. But it can be very easy from that perspective to think and talk about the cross of Jesus in a way that is very theoretical, right? Abstract, and even academic. You know, we may use all the right vocabulary words. We might make all the right cross references in our Bible, do all the right things. But I'm afraid if we don't take just a moment to slow down and consider what that day looked like from a pretty physical perspective. we may miss some of the change of heart that it's intended to bring in us. You know, we rightfully talk about all the things that Jesus, the Son of God, accomplished at the cross, and we need as much of that as we can get. But I do think we ought to never forget about what Jesus, the man, endured. Jesus experienced this suffering in fully human form. It wasn't God in a man suit, suffered it in fully human form. So much so that he didn't appear to Pilate to be anything special at all. And I think it can be a really powerful thing to stop for a moment and kind of visualize that tattered, exhausted, almost lifeless Jesus that Pilate brought forth wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. To see that and be reminded that that's what God's Son was willing to become to redeem you and me from our sins. You know, one of the things that I think we always have to guard against in our weekly observance of this supper is not ever allowing it to become stale and routine and thoughtless. Let me suggest to you that these words in John 19, that image maybe, can be the antidote for stale and routine. That's not the thing that invites the complacency. That's the thing that can drive it out. This probably won't shock you, but I love the way the old hymn puts it. When my love to Christ, when my love for others, when my faith, when anything about my spiritual life grows weak and isn't what it should be, the first place I ought to go mentally is the Garden of Gethsemane, right? The hill of Calvary, and to see that suffering, friendless one, suffering there for me. And as I wrap up, I think also about those apostles who were with Jesus for those 3 years of his earthly ministry, who were with him in the upper room, who saw in one form or another the things that he suffered. I wonder what it was like for them as they came together in the weeks and months after Jesus ascended. I wonder what it was like for them as they came together to partake of the Lord's Supper. Obviously, don't know a lot of details about what that room looked like, but I have a feeling, I'm very confident that they didn't need somebody like me to stumble through an 18-minute talk to help them get their minds in the right place. I have a feeling for those who had truly beheld the man, who had seen the cross for what it is and who saw that Jesus of John 19, 4 and 5. Those simple words, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do so in remembrance of me. I think those words were probably enough. And so this morning, as we partake, let's do our best to behold the man ourselves and to see his great love in the things that he suffered for us. At this time, we'll ask the men to come forward in service.